In 1987, Robert Crandall, the notoriously aggressive CEO of American Airlines, ordered his catering team to remove exactly one olive from every first-class salad served on board. The change was invisible to passengers. Nobody complained. Nobody noticed. But the accounting department noticed. That single olive reportedly saved American Airlines around $40,000 per year. One garnish, $40,000. It sounds absurd until you understand the financial reality that forced a man running a multi-billion-dollar corporation to personally obsess over a piece of fruit. For decades since, the commercial aviation industry has operated under a painful truth that most passengers never consider. Your airline is almost certainly barely surviving. In 2025, IATA projected the global airline industry would generate $36 billion in net profit across roughly 5 billion passengers. That works out to around $7 in profit per person, not per flight, per person. The industry that moves the entire planet earns less per customer than the price of a London Starbucks latte. But here's what makes no sense. Airlines generated over $1 trillion in total revenue. They operated nearly 39 million commercial flights. They employed millions of people worldwide. Yet, the profit margin sat at just 3.7%. That means for every $180 ticket you purchase, the airline keeps roughly $6.66 as actual profit. The rest, all $173.34, vanishes before the wheels leave the ground. So, where does your $180 actually go? And if airlines keep almost nothing, who is really making money from your flight? To understand why running an airline is so brutally difficult, you need to follow your ticket price dollar by dollar through the system that consumes it. Let's take a standard $180 domestic ticket in the United States. The moment you click purchase, that money begins fragmenting across at least 7 distinct cost categories, each controlled by a different entity, most of which have significantly more pricing power than the airline itself. The first and largest claim comes from labor. In the United States, salaries and benefits consume roughly a third of total operating expenses. On your $180 ticket, that's around $60. This covers pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, mechanics, dispatchers, and the vast administrative infrastructure required to operate a certified airline. Pilot wages alone have surged dramatically since 2022, driven by a severe pilot shortage that forced regional carriers to raise starting pay from around $30,000 to well over $90,000 just to prevent pilots from walking to major airlines. But labor is only the beginning. The second largest claim is fuel. Jet fuel consistently accounts for between 20 and 35% of total operating expenses, depending on global oil prices and regional variation. For US carriers, fuel typically represents around 20% of operating costs. On your $180 ticket, that's roughly $35. But the figure is deceptively stable. Fuel is the single most volatile cost an airline faces. When oil prices spike, jet fuel can push some carriers' fuel share above 40% of total costs. A single New York to London flight on an Airbus A330 burns approximately 22,500 gallons of fuel, which at typical jet fuel prices means tens of thousands of dollars for a one-way trip. US airlines collectively spend tens of billions of dollars on fuel every year. That's hundreds of millions of dollars burned every single day. Airlines attempt to manage this through fuel hedging, buying financial contracts to lock in future fuel prices for 6 to 12 months ahead. Most carriers hedge between 30 to 60% of their fuel requirements, but hedging is a double-edged sword. If oil prices collapse after you've locked in a higher rate, you're paying above market prices, while competitors benefit from the drop. Southwest ended its hedging program in 2025 after years of mixed results. Delta Airlines took perhaps the most radical approach in aviation history. In 2012, facing a $12 billion annual fuel bill that represented more than a third of its operating expenses, Delta simply purchased a crude oil refinery in Trainer, Pennsylvania. The strategy was to directly control the crack spread, the cost gap between crude oil and refined jet fuel. essentially insulating itself from refinery bottlenecks. Analysts called it insane, Delta called it survival. Latin American and Caribbean airlines face an even harsher reality. Fuel can account for more than a third of their operating costs due to geography, infrastructure, and taxation. Now your ticket has already surrendered roughly $95 to labor and fuel, but the airport is waiting. Airport and landing fees consume another chunk of airline operating expenses. On your $180 bill, that's around $13. This covers landing fees, gate leases, terminal usage charges, and ground handling services. At major hubs like John F. Kennedy International Airport, landing and takeoff fees alone cost thousands of dollars per flight, depending on aircraft weight and time slot. Then come the passenger-facing charges. A passenger facility charge of up to $4.50 per enplanement is embedded directly into your ticket. The September 11th security fee adds another $5.60 per one-way trip. Federal excise tax claims 7.5% of the base fare, segment fees at around $5 per domestic segment before the airline has earned a single cent. The government and the airport have extracted a combined $15 to $20 from your $180 ticket. This is why Willie Walsh, the Director General of IATA and former CEO of British Airways, has repeatedly warned that even small regulatory fee increases can eliminate airline profitability entirely. As he put it in 2025, it's still a thin buffer, and any new tax, increase in airport navigation charge, demand shock, or costly regulation will quickly put the industry's resilience to the test. Your ticket has now been carved down to around $70, but the aircraft itself demands payment. Maintenance, repair, and overhaul consumes a meaningful share of operating expenses. On your $180 ticket, that's roughly $10. Aircraft depreciation and amortization claim around another $9. Combined, keeping the airplane structurally sound and financially accounted for takes close to $20 from every ticket. But here's where the economics become genuinely hostile. A new Boeing 737 MAX carries a list price north of $100 million, though airlines rarely pay list. Because most airlines cannot afford to purchase fleets outright, roughly half the world's 35,000-plus commercial aircraft are owned by leasing companies. During the ongoing supply chain crisis, lease rates have spiked to record highs as airlines fight desperately for available metal. The reason? Aircraft manufacturers couldn't deliver. Boeing and Airbus have been consistently running well below their delivery targets, with combined output falling short of projections by hundreds of aircraft per year. The global backlog of unfulfilled aircraft orders now sits at around 17,000 planes, representing 12 to 14 years of manufacturing output at current rates. Average delivery times have stretched from around 4.5 years pre-pandemic to nearly 7 years today. And the supply chain crisis has been made catastrophically worse by the Pratt & Whitney GTF engine debacle. In 2023, Pratt & Whitney disclosed a rare powder metal defect, requiring mandatory recalls and inspections of 600 to 700 engines. By 2025, hundreds of GTF-powered Airbus A320neo aircraft were grounded or sitting in storage. Airlines were left with billion-dollar assets functioning as what industry observers grimly called 60-ton lawn ornaments. The Indian carrier, Go First, filed for bankruptcy, explicitly blaming Pratt & Whitney after the engine defect forced the grounding of roughly half its fleet. Lessors began cannibalizing nearly new aircraft just to harvest working engines for other planes. By 2026, Airbus itself was pursuing damages against Pratt & Whitney as the shortage choked its production lines. And the manufacturers responsible for these delays? Willie Walsh didn't mince words. At a 2025 IATA briefing in Geneva, he stated, "The people causing the supply chain delays are being rewarded with record profits. They're making massive margins at the same time as doing a shit job rewarding the product." Engine overhaul companies have posted operating margins near 30%. Aircraft part suppliers have achieved similar margins. Airlines, meanwhile, operated at 3.7%. Your $180 has now been reduced to approximately $40. What's left falls under the industry's catch-all category. other operating expenses. This roughly 20% slice covers aircraft rents, insurance, global distribution system fees, crew hotels, sales commissions, IT infrastructure, and irregular operations. Irregular operations, known as IROPS, represents one of the most unpredictable cost sinkholes. A single emergency landing due to a mechanical issue can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. A storm system forcing 50 cancellations generates millions in hotel accommodations, meal vouchers, and rebooking expenses overnight. After all of this, the airline is left with approximately $7 from your $180 ticket. That is the actual profit, less than 4%. The return on invested capital for the global airline industry has historically sat below its cost of capital. Airlines, in aggregate, have been systematically destroying shareholder value for decades, earning less from capital invested than what capital costs to deploy. As IATA projected for 2026, even with record revenues expected to approach $1 trillion and a forecasted 84% load factor, the highest in history, net profit margins would stretch to only around 4%. Herb Kelleher, the legendary founder of Southwest Airlines, captured this absurdity perfectly. If the Wright brothers were alive today, he once said, Wilbur would have to fire Orville to reduce costs. But here's where this story takes a big unexpected turn. The significance of the $7 profit per passenger isn't about poor management, and it isn't really about volatile fuel prices. It's about what this margin reality has forced airlines to become. The most financially successful airlines in the world have quietly transformed into something that looks nothing like a transportation company. They've become banks. Delta Airline collected over $8 billion in cash from American Express in 2025. To put that number into perspective, Delta's total operating income for that year was in the $5 to $6 billion range. The credit card partnership generated more than the entire airline operation itself. Delta's CEO, Ed Bastian, has publicly stated a long-term target of growing this partnership revenue to $10 billion annually. The mechanism is elegant. Every time a consumer swipes a Delta-branded American Express card at a grocery store, a gas station, or an online retailer, American Express pays Delta for the reward miles issued. As Bastian himself has noted, a significant share of American Express's US customer spending transacts on Delta co-branded cards. Because miles are effectively a fiat currency created by the airline at near zero marginal cost, the profit margins on selling them to banks are astronomically higher than on selling seats. You see, the $180 ticket isn't really the product anymore. The ticket is the mechanism that keeps the loyalty currency valuable. Without flights, miles are worthless. But without miles, the airline might not survive financially. This inversion explains why airlines invest billions in premium cabins, branded lounges, and status tiers that seem economically irrational on their own. These investments don't need to generate direct profit. They need to maintain the aspirational brand value that makes customers desire the credit card, which generates the actual money. Delta has paid out over $10 billion in profit sharing to its employees over the past decade, an unparalleled figure in the Fortune 500, funded largely by the economic flywheel that the American Express partnership created. The airline's post-bankruptcy turnaround wasn't built on better routes or cheaper fuel, it was built on becoming a financial institution that happens to operate airplanes. Not every airline can play the loyalty banking game. Southwest Airlines pioneered a fundamentally different survival strategy built on operational efficiency. For decades, Southwest operated exclusively one aircraft type, the Boeing 737. This homogeneous fleet eliminated fragmented pilot training, simplified maintenance, reduced spare part inventories, and allowed any crew to operate any aircraft in the system. Southwest's famous bags fly free policy wasn't a marketing gimmick, it was an operational calculation. By not charging for checked bags, passengers brought fewer carry-ons, overhead bins filled more slowly, Boarding times decreased, and aircraft spent less time on the ground. Since airplanes only generate revenue when they're in the air, faster turnarounds translated directly to profit. Southwest posted hundreds of millions of dollars in net profit in 2024, consistent with decades of profitability that once made it the envy of the industry. But even this model faced its limits. Rising fuel costs, increased labor rates, and Boeing's delivery delays stalled Southwest's stock. The activist investor, Elliott Investment Management, acquired roughly a 16% stake and forced a massive restructuring. In a move that stunned the industry, Southwest abandoned its 54-year-old open seating policy, introduced assigned seating, and fundamentally altered its distribution model. Southwest didn't change because its model failed. It changed because a Wall Street investor with enough leverage decided the model wasn't extracting value fast enough. Even a consistently profitable airline is ultimately at the mercy of capital markets that demand growth, not stability. The $7 profit figure is a global average. It conceals enormous regional variation that reveals who actually benefits from commercial aviation. Middle Eastern carriers achieve the highest per-passenger profits in the industry, often over $20. North American Airlines earn around $10 to $12. European carriers manage somewhere in the high single digits. Asia-Pacific carriers scrape by on $1 or $2. Latin American and African airlines often lose money per passenger outright. Emirates declared over $5 billion in annual profits in its most recent fiscal year. Qatar Airways reported a record $2.15 billion. These Gulf carriers benefit from sovereign banking, strategic geographic positioning between continents, modern fleets, and minimal taxation. They represent a fundamentally different economic model than the publicly traded, debt-burdened Western carriers fighting over $7. And yet, every airline, regardless of region, faces the same structural challenge. The industry's return on invested capital consistently falls below its cost of capital. Airlines are, in aggregate, paying for the privilege of operating. The future threatens to make everything worse. The industry has committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. The transition relies on sustainable aviation fuel and emerging technologies like hydrogen propulsion. IATA estimates the transition will add hundreds of billions of dollars to global fuel costs by 2050. Under this scenario, fuel shares of operating costs would rocket from around 30% to 45%. Without the transition, projected air traffic growth would push total industry costs above $2 trillion by 2050. With the net zero mandate, costs rise close to $3 trillion. Industry analysts have bluntly noted that absorbing a 30% increase in total costs is mathematically impossible for an industry operating on a 3% net profit margin. Total revenue in 2050 would fall hundreds of billions of dollars short of covering the green transition. Meanwhile, the global fleet is aging rapidly. The average commercial aircraft age reached a record 15 years in 2025, as delivery delays forced airlines to fly older, less fuel-efficient planes. IATA forecasts that the supply backlog will not normalize until somewhere between 2031 and 2034. Average return airfares in 2025 were estimated to be more than a third lower in real terms compared to 2015, and projected to fall further by 2026. Passengers are paying less, costs are rising, the math is unforgiving. In 1987, Robert Crandall removed an olive from a salad because American Airlines couldn't afford the garnish. It wasn't a publicity stunt, it was desperation disguised as efficiency. The route to profitability ran through a fruit bowl because every other cost center had already been squeezed. Nearly 4 decades later, the airline industry has refined that desperation into an art form. The $180 ticket you purchase today is devoured by labor at around $60, fuel at $35, airport fees at $13, maintenance at $10, depreciation at $9, taxes and surcharges at $18, distribution and insurance and IROPS at $26. And what remains is approximately $7, maybe less. Maybe a Big Mac, maybe a latte, maybe one olive. When you board your next flight, you'll be sitting inside a $100 million aircraft, burning tens of thousands of dollars worth of fuel, operated by crews demanding historically high wages, landing at airports that charge thousands of dollars for the privilege of touching the runway, maintained by mechanics increasingly difficult to hire, powered by engines that may or may not have a manufacturing defect. And the airlines that orchestrated all of this will keep roughly what you spend on lunch. The industry supports tens of millions of jobs. It contributes nearly 4% of global GDP. It transports over 5 billion people per year. It generates $1 trillion in revenue. And it survives on margins thinner than the aluminium skin holding the fuselage together. The question isn't whether airlines can continue operating on $7 per passenger, it's whether the rest of the world is really paying attention to what happens when they can't.